All right, so this talk is just a continuation on what yesterday was, which is what is lipolysis, which essentially is fat splitting or breaking down your fat tissue for energy. What I want to go through today is kind of the mechanisms and the steps of how we turn our body fat into actual energy our body uses. So the eventual goal of all of this is to get to a molecule called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. It's an adenosine molecule with 3 phosphates attached. That's the eventual goal of all of our metabolism, is to generate this molecule. Now, we can get there with our own body fat, but it goes through a series of stages. The first stage we talked about yesterday, which is lipolysis. When you're in a situation where you are in need of energy, and your energy is low, and your body is devoid or has a low level of glucose and insulin flowing through your veins, your body signals a cascade of hormones called glucagon, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. These 3 hormones trigger the breakdown of adipose tissue and release triglycerides into your bloodstream. So in order for you to access the fat on your body, the insulin inside your body has to be low. And as you guys have probably heard me say 1,000 times, the way we get our insulin low is by not putting sugar in our body. And I mean sugar in the sense of carbohydrate. I don't mean like pixie sticks. I mean anything with glucose in it. Any amount of macronutrient going into your face is going to have a requisite insulin spike. But some things spike more than others. A steak has a pretty low insulinogenic effect. Pixie sticks have a very high insulinogenic effect. So step 1 is getting your insulin to be low. Now this happens a few different ways. This happens at rest. This happens when fasting. This happens during hard, sustained exercise. And I mean sustained like more than like 3 minutes. I don't mean like Fran at elite levels or a bike sprint. I mean long, slow distance, kind of like what you're doing today. When that happens, your body senses that your blood sugar is low and it realizes that it needs nutrients in the cell to create energy, because the energy is what allows us to keep moving. So when blood sugar and insulin are low, we create lipolysis. And essentially, again, that's taking the triglycerides out of your adipose tissue and getting them into your bloodstream so they can be used as energy. When we have lipolysis occurring, there's a molecule called hormone-sensitive lipase. It's the hormone-sensitive lipase. It's an enzyme that responds to low levels of insulin and high levels of glucagon, those 2 hormones that act in opposition to one another, along with epinephrine and norepinephrine, to split triglycerides into 2 constituent parts: fatty acids and glycerol. Glycerol is then shuttled to the liver where it's turned into glucose via gluconeogenesis. The fatty acids attach to part of your blood called albumin and get brought to tissues like your muscles, your liver, your heart, everything that needs energy. So the first stage in fat metabolism is lipolysis, getting the fat out of the tissue, which again only occurs if insulin is low. Once we get that fat tissue broken down and circulating to where it needs to go, it enters the next stage in the process, which is something called beta-oxidation. This is one step before we start creating ATP inside the mitochondria. So this is occurring outside of the mitochondria on the way into the mitochondria. But essentially it's taking a fatty acid, which is nothing more than a chain of carbon molecules, all the carbons attached to hydrogen, and there's these long extended chains. So like, for example, glucose, the sugar that we're talking about more commonly than not, is 6 carbons. Fatty acids can be as few as like 8, all the way to like 30 per fatty acid. So if it's 30 per and there's 3 fatty acids, we're talking 90 chains of carbon inside of this long chain. We'll talk about why that matters in a minute. In beta-oxidation, we take something called a fatty acid and we turn it into acetyl-CoA. You guys aren't getting quizzed on this, you don't have to remember what that is. But just know it's taking these long chains of carbon and turning them into 2 carbon long segments. So from C, 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 all connected by a single bond, into pairs of CC, CC, CC. Each one of these can then go into the Krebs cycle. When that happens, When acetyl-CoA goes into the Krebs cycle, again, this is your citric acid cycle, this is your TCA cycle, this is the stuff you go back to like high school biology, they talked about creating energy. We start to create the byproducts that allow us to create ATP in our body. So when that acetyl-CoA goes into the Krebs cycle, and it combines with another molecule called oxaloacetate, it creates something called citrate, and then these two fancy molecules called NADH and FADH2. Again, not getting quizzed on this, but this matters for the step and what happens next. Essentially, think of it this way. Things are getting broken down more and more, getting ready to be turned into something more and more useful. So we have this byproduct that's storage that's eventually getting turned into energy. In the Krebs cycle, acetyl-CoA and the oxaloacetate, however you say that, gets turned into citrate and these two molecules. Now these two molecules are really important because they go into the next stage here, which is the ETC, the electron transport chain. What this allows us to do is to turn ADP plus phosphate back into ATP. And what's unique about fat relative to carbohydrate, other than the fact you have a lot of it on your body and we want to tap into it, is that it's very efficient. NADH, for every single molecule of NADH you have, you get 3 ATP. For every single FADH2, you get 2 ATP. And that's for every single one of these little bonds that are broken. Every single one. Remember, we're talking about chains that are extremely long when compared to carbohydrate. So comparing the two fuel sources, fat versus carbohydrate, you have a small reserve on your body, and each molecule of glucose only nets about 6 ATP because there are 6 carbons, and they get into 3 pairs, and there's 2 ATP per pair. That gets us 6 ATP. Whereas you have something like that super long chain of fatty acid that could be upwards of 30 long, now we're getting hundreds of ATP relative to one fatty acid compared to with one molecule of glucose. So if you can begin to understand how we can take the fat in our body to create this long, sustaining, clean burning energy that's already on us, that most of us don't want, and can turn it into energy, we now have the ability to use the fat on our body for energy. And this always comes down to like, okay, like why do I care, right? That's ultimately all you'd ever want from this. And what I hope you guys ever take from these is like, what actually matters, Bob? I don't really give a fuck about ADP or APC or all-oxaloacetate. Take-home message is this. You have a giant reserve of energy on your body. For you to tap into that energy, you have to keep your carbohydrate load low. Not saying don't eat them, but eat the low glycemic variety. Train regularly. Get some sleep. Get some recovery in your life. And every once in a while, maybe experiment with fasting, and you'll be able to tap into this energy source. And the reason why you should care, again, other than it's efficient, is that anyone know what brain fog is? Brain fog? Do you know what's most closely associated with brain fog? What other type of thing that we talk a lot about in here? No, you might, honestly, eventually, yes, Alzheimer's may be a thing. But more importantly is, when someone has high levels of insulin, and their body's constantly going through those spikes and valleys of putting things in your face that spike your blood sugar and drop, it messes with your mental acuity. So what we're doing here is controlling ourselves so that we're not having these issues where we're struggling with mental acuity because we're dealing with insulin spikes all day. We have this tremendous reserve of energy that we'd all like to burn and use. Like you'd like to come here and be like, yes, this thing that I used to have is not here anymore. And then last but not least, this type of energy source is what powers your long duration activities. So if you're like, man, I really wish I had better endurance in my conditioning workouts here, or I wish I had more stamina just in general in life. Like we all know that person in our life who are like, hey, come help me do something, and they're good for about 5 minutes, and they're sitting down, and you're like, I thought we were doing something, and I'm the only one doing something now. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. If they were able to tap into their fat stores that have that energy they needed for those long bouts. So the take-home message again, if you can control your insulin, aka get it to drop, you'll be better apt to burn the fat on your body, and here is how that works. And the reason why you care is because you're gonna have better mental acuity, you're gonna have better endurance, And most importantly, you're going to be able to use the fat that you're already stored in large quantities here and not be forced to constantly take in sugar. Questions?
How long does that process take?
How long does it take from start to finish?
In the middle of a workout or stuff?
It's happening all the time, Dave. So the way I want you to think about this, hold on, I'm going to get a pen. All right, so there's 3 ways our body generates energy. We have the PCR, glycolysis, and this is, again, beta-oxidation or aerobic. Those are our 3 metabolic engines. At all times, one is revved up high, the other 2 are involved but idling. The longer the duration and the more you have of the substrate, meaning the more of it you have, and I mean in your face, the quicker you can tap into this. So if you're someone who is constantly putting sugar in your body, you are blunting your body's own ability to metabolize fat. And that happens because insulin is high, and when insulin is high, this first step in the cascade doesn't occur. You're going to constantly be craving sugar, and that problem with that is that when you have excess sugar, you don't burn it, you store it. And you store it as a thing you can't use anymore. This comes this self-fulfilling prophecy where you always are putting sugar in your face and using some of it and then hanging on to the rest. And instead of being able to tap into it, it just grows and grows and grows and grows and becomes less and less useful and more metabolically deranged, leading to chronic disease. So to answer your question, they're all kind of always all happening. We're trying to rev this engine, which is this over here, not these 2. These are important to have, right? It's important to be able to have those and tap into those when you need them. But for most of what we do here, we're living on this side, and we want to be able to use this to our advantage. Did that answer your question? Any other questions? Cool. Thanks for hanging out, guys. Enjoy your workout if you haven't done it yet.